Apparently, we learned that conservatives are very susceptible to misinformation, according to science. So, according to science, you're an idiot. That's what we're learning today. Very classic of anybody, either the left or the right, is going to take a piece of science, data, research, and try to carve it into their worldview and how they view things. And based on this piece of research and study that this man found, apparently conservatives are way more highly susceptible to misinformation informing their voting behavior than the liberals are. It was based off this study where they offered 4 questions. And again, based on what the study's saying, just want to make that clear. Based on what the study's saying, they gave 4 statements. Only one of them is true. The other 3 are false. And if you, depending how strongly you react to each one either being true or false, showed how open and susceptible you are to misinformation. So we'll try the test with you at home first. First statement. Canada's economic growth lags well behind the G7 average. Is it completely true, just true, false, or completely false? You answer that. Number 2, vaccine-related deaths are being concealed from the public. Same scale, completely true, just false, completely false. The right to bear arms is guaranteed in Canada's constitution. And then number 4, climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So as I said, out of those 4, based on this study and their narrative, they say only one of those is true. And the one that is true, according to them, is climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. The other 3 I mentioned were completely false. And that, my friends, is how they based this study on how conservatives are more susceptible to misinformation online. Reg, you have the floor.
So first off, what a way to bait people. They're like, what are topics that we know are going to be hot with conservatives and that are going to be good for liberal voters, that they're going to be able to see right through this? And what is going to be the narrative that a liberal voter is going to hear? And what is a narrative that a conservative voter is going to hear? And we can actually design this study to give the answers that we want. And that's what happened with this. And the best part is that it was done so poorly that when you actually look at the quote unquote data, if you go by Minister Freeland, she says, we're doing the best in the G7, blah, 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 blah. You listen to South of the Border, they also say the same thing. What's funny is that when you actually look at articles, so the Fraser Institute actually looked at our economy. So they said, our economy is not booming, it's stagnating. Then if you look at the TD economic report, says that economic growth does not necessarily equate to economic prosperity. While aggregate GDP is one thing, standard of living is another. And when Canada's economic performance is adjusted for the rising population count, it reveals a picture that leaves much to be desired. So that was straight out of the TD economic report. Also in the Fraser Institute, it says, despite turning solid headline growth in recent years, Canada has lagged behind the US and other advanced economies in terms of standard of living performance or real GDP. Basically, what we're looking at is the fact that you have multiple reputable sources all saying that they're hiding the information about GDP because what they're doing is they're using population growth as a way to try and bump up the numbers. They're also using the fact that the government has added so many public service jobs to try and cover up the fact that the private sector is like literally dwindling, and that the amount of layoffs that we're seeing in Canada and the amount of people losing their jobs, it would be indicative of a recession if you didn't have the massive amount of immigration and the massive amount of hiring in the public service. So the government is artificially trying to pump up our GDP to try and make it look good. And so what the banks and what Fraser Institute and others like them are saying is like, this is all a smokescreen. It's fake. It's not actually the case.
Fugazi.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So what we're seeing is not reality. So then when they put a question like this, like Canada's GDP is, lagging behind other economic powers in the G7, it is. But if you try and fake it by doing all these other things, then yeah, you can try and tweak it. And the other thing too is that depending on how you slice the data, you can make data say whatever you want. And it depends on what statistical analysis you do. It depends on what you determine as an outlier. And I know all this because I work with data. This is literally my job. So
I think
what's really awesome though is, so Steve holds this up as like an example of like, conservatives so dumb. I can't believe they think our GDP is lagging behind. Then I got a nice little screenshot for you. So it says G7 productivity growth since pre-pandemic 2019, and they show Canada at minus 0.15, and everybody else doing real great. Mm-hmm. And so he, in this video, is actually calling out the fact that Canada's, economy is really suffering compared to its G7 partners. But in the other video then talks about how stupid conservatives are for believing that we're lagging behind in the G7.
This comes back down to semantics too as well. You talked about obviously kind of what you're using as the data that you're sourcing off of how you splice the data, as well as this is me as a UX designer comes in. This is how I conduct my studies and how I come up with questions. It's all in the wording too. Mm-hmm. Like the trick question is they can technically get away with the fact that this is technically false, where they say Canada's economic growth lags well behind the G7 average. So the G7 average is like what? Say in the maybe the 2% range, maybe. All I'm saying is technically Canada isn't well behind the average, but we're behind.
Yeah.
And how do you define well behind? Like it's just so many just subjective terms that are being used to then kind of pigeonhole and get your narrative.
Then the second question about COVID deaths. And so this was actually kind of a good learning experience for me, because this is where I found out that we actually have a organization called the Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance System, the lovely acronym CAFIS. And so they report 1,237 incidents, or as of March 2022. That was when they did this draw. They also excluded any reports that were missing time from vaccination onset, or if they were missing the amount of dose that they had, or if they were missing the person's sex. So a lot more cases, but if they were missing any piece of those three pieces of information, they didn't include them in that number. And so what's interesting is when you have a whole organization, government funded, devoted to vaccine injuries and adverse effects of vaccines, specifically focusing in on our most recent mRNA vaccine. That's what's concerning to me. Now, I'm not here to debate the validity of vaccines. I'm fully vaccinated with I got the 2 shots of Pfizer. There we go.
Who gives a crap?
So, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. The fact is, this exists.
Right.
And the fact is that, like, I think it was even News for Real on TikTok. Mm-hmm. And he's like, "Oh, did you hear the news?" That guy. And so anyway, he was like actually talking from a hospital in Ontario. I don't know what the context was, but he was talking about these different people that he had spoken to who all had issues with myocarditis,
right?
Since getting the jab, right? And so it's like, these are the stories you don't hear about, and these are the stories that would look really, really bad. And then there's actually been multiple lawsuits against Pfizer right now because they've been concealing data. And so then when you read that statement in that bit there where it says, the government is concealing COVID deaths or deaths related to the vaccine, it's like, yeah, that's happening. We can see that it's happening. And so it's really, really frustrating. You can find this information, but it doesn't fit the narrative that's on the mainstream. The other one was kind of a red herring, like the right to bear arms. Like, we know that's the states. Yeah. We know that's not in our Canadian Constitution. What is in our Canadian Constitution, this one's just for fun. Even though we don't have the right to bear arms, we apparently have the right to freedom of speech in the press, peaceful assembly, travel, due process, privacy, an attorney, and speedy trial for criminal cases and trial by a jury in certain cases. So 5 of the 7 of those, our current prime minister doesn't think we have, because he's walked all over those. True. So that's just a fun aside. But It really just goes to show when you write something from your own narrative in a way that's using, like you said, key terms to try and trick people and to try and capture a certain group of the population and make them look dumb. That is what made me livid. Mm-hmm. That's what really got me going.
And rightfully so. It upset me because it upset me first because I sent it to you. I was dumbfounded, I think would be the word, of kind of looking at this. And I was like, okay, I was honestly, when I was looking at it from a surface, I was like, oh, wow. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Wow, conservatives are more likely to be misinformed voters versus what liberals are. I'm curious. All right, what's the background behind this? And I looked at how the study was conducted and the questions they're asking, and based on how they asked them, I was like, what are we doing here? I don't know how, Mr. Boots, I don't know how in good conscience you can put that out to your followers and think that is the right thing to do. That is so dishonest and harmful and, quite frankly, idiotic to be doing. And that's coming from me, from one white bearded guy to another. And I was just dumbfounded because, like I said, I typically have given this guy the benefit of the doubt. He's typically fair. But I've seen too much at this point where I'm like, okay, now you're just trying to drive your bias, you're trying to drive your narrative, and it needs to stop because it's causing more of a divide here, and it needs to end now. That was electric, wasn't it? Well, we enjoyed it. Hope you did too. If you did, you can check this video out here to the top right corner right near my window. Get over. There it is. There it is right there. And if you liked that, you can also check this one right here. We love you. Have a good one. Peace out.